Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by real events. However, the names of the characters have been changed to protect privacy. Story 1. The Mysterious Hockomock Forest. The Hockomock Forest, located deep in the famous Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, in the fall of 1998, wore a mysterious and dangerous beauty. The rows of tall, ancient trees with dense foliage almost completely blocked the sunlight, creating a dark and damp space. Underfoot was a thick layer of rotting carpet, hiding countless traps and fanged wild animals. Locals have long passed down scary stories about this forest, where many people foolishly tried their luck and then never returned. Alex, a young man full of enthusiasm and confidence in his survival skills, had heard those stories since he was a child. He had always harbored a desire to explore the mysteries hidden deep within the Hockomock. Together with his three best friends, Megan, Chris, and Sarah, Alex planned an expedition deep into the forbidden forest. Megan, a smart and cautious girl, had repeatedly advised Alex to give up this dangerous idea, but his eagerness and Chris and Sarah's curiosity finally convinced her. "I still don't feel good about this," Megan said, her voice filled with worry as they began to enter the edge of the forest. "Everyone says this is a dangerous place, full of predators and poisonous snakes." Alex patted Megan's shoulder, smiling confidently. "Don't worry too much, Megan. We've prepared carefully. We'll be careful and not go too deep." Chris and Sarah nodded in agreement, their faces filled with excitement for the upcoming adventure. As they walked deeper into the forest, the light grew dimmer. The chirping of birds gave way to strange, eerie sounds. The rustling of leaves beneath their feet sounded like someone was watching. Megan felt an indescribable unease rising in her heart, and she kept reminding everyone to be careful. As night began to fall, they decided to stop and set up camp. They lit a large fire to ward off wild animals and keep warm. As the fire flickered, casting ghostly shadows on the surrounding trees, Chris suddenly told a story he had heard from a local. They say that on moonless nights, a female ghost in a red dress hovers above the tallest trees in this forest. Chris whispered, his voice slightly creepy. "If anyone sees her, they will encounter bad luck, even death." "Do you believe in that?" Sarah asked timidly. Chris shrugged. "I don't know, but there are a lot of people who have disappeared in this forest without a trace. There must be something strange here." The night was getting deeper and deeper. The wind whistling through the trees sounded like the wailing of lost souls. The campfire flickered and then gradually died down. Darkness enveloped the forest, carrying with it invisible fears. Suddenly, from afar, a strange sound rang out, like the sound of a twig snapping. All four of them were startled, listening tensely in the quiet night. They didn't know what was waiting for them in this mysterious forest. After the sound of a twig snapping in the dark, all four of them fell silent, their hearts pounding in their chests. The campfire had almost died down. Only a few flickering embers remained, not enough to dispel the thick darkness that covered the forest. The wind whistling through the tall trees sounded like someone was whispering scary words. "Did you hear anything?" Sarah asked softly, her voice trembling. Chris nodded, his eyes straining as he peered into the darkness around them. "It sounds like it's to the west. That way." Alex held the flashlight tightly, carefully shining it in the direction Chris was pointing. The weak light only illuminated a small area, adding to the mysterious and terrifying feel of the forest. "It's probably just a wild animal." He tried to reassure everyone, but his voice couldn't hide the worry. Megan held Alex's arm tightly, her eyes never leaving the dark shadows of the trees. "I don't like this at all. We should go back now." Just then, another noise rang out, this time clearer, like light footsteps approaching them. The sound was not like the footsteps of an animal, but rather a steady, rhythmic one, as if someone was deliberately walking very quietly so as not to be detected. All four of them held their breath, listening intently. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped abruptly just outside the faint circle of light from the dying fire. They could sense the presence of someone, or something, standing just outside the darkness, watching their every move. "Is anyone there?" Alex asked, his voice trying to sound calm but still a little shaky. There was no answer. Only the wind howled and the insects chirped in the night. The eerie silence fell over the forest, making everyone's pounding hearts more audible than ever. Suddenly, a tall figure passed between the trees, only appearing for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. But in that brief moment, all four of them clearly saw a streak of bright red, like a cloak fluttering in the wind. "Did you see that?" Chris stuttered, his face pale with fear. It seems to be the woman in red they've been talking about." Megan let out a small scream, hugging Alex tightly. Sarah was shaking too, her eyes wide with terror. Alex tried to stay calm, but he couldn't help but panic. He pointed his flashlight in the direction where they had seen the figure. But all he could see was black trees and vast darkness. Maybe we're seeing things wrong," Alex said, but his voice lacked his usual certainty. But none of them believed it. They all sensed a terrifying presence very close to them. Something evil and dangerous lurking in the darkness of the Hockomock forest. That night, none of them dared to sleep. They huddled around the dying fire, listening to every sound in the night, waiting for the dawn to dispel the darkness and the fears that surrounded them. They knew that this expedition was beyond anything they could have imagined, and that they had perhaps awakened a dark force they could not confront. As the first rays of dawn broke through the dense canopy, all four of them jumped up almost at the same time. The fear and exhaustion of a sleepless night were evident on each of their faces. Without a word, they quickly packed up their tents in a hurry, their movements clumsy because their hands were still shaking. Their only goal now was to get out of this terrifying forest as soon as possible. "We have to go now," Megan said, her voice urgent. "I don't want to stay here another second." Alex nodded in agreement, his expression serious. "I think we should follow the rising sun. Hopefully it will lead us out of the forest." They began to move, their footsteps hurriedly on the damp, rotten carpet. The forest in the morning was still dark and quiet, but it no longer had the mysterious look of last night. Instead, it had a hidden menace, as if everything around was lurking and waiting. When they had gone a fair distance, Chris suddenly stopped, pointing ahead in horror. "Look!" In front of them was a giant venomous snake, its body as thick as an adult's forearm, slithering across the trail. Its scales glistened in the dim light, its sharp triangular head and cold eyes staring at them. All four of them stood frozen, not daring to move. That's a rattlesnake," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with fear. "What do we do now?" Alex slowly backed away, signaling everyone to follow him. They carefully avoided the venomous snake and found another path to take. But the forest seemed unwilling to let them go. The deeper they went, the more treacherous the terrain became. More and more bogs appeared. The mud dug deep under their feet, making it difficult to move. The tangled branches stabbed into their faces and arms, leaving bloody scratches. As they were trying to cross a muddy area, Megan suddenly slipped and fell. She cried out in pain. Alex rushed to help her up. But Megan's ankle was sprained. She couldn't go on. "I'm sorry, everyone," Megan said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't go on." Alex looked at his friends worriedly. They were deep in the woods. And Megan was injured. The situation was dire. "We can't leave you here," Alex said, his voice firm. "Chris, you and Sarah, help me carry Megan." They tried to help Megan continue. But the movement became extremely slow and difficult. At this time, they heard strange noises again. The light footsteps they had heard last night rang out again. This time more clearly and seemed to be getting closer to them. All four of them felt an extreme fear. They knew that something was following them. And it was getting closer. Suddenly, from in front of them, between the dense trees, appeared a streak of bright red. The tall figure of a woman in red was floating in the air. Her long black hair fluttering in the wind. Her face was pale, her deep black eyes staring at them with an indescribable fear. This time, she did not just pass by, but stood there, as if blocking their way. A scream of horror rang out from Sarah's throat. Chris's face was pale as well. And Megan hugged Alex tightly, trembling uncontrollably. Alex knew that they couldn't face this thing. He shouted, "Run!" The four of them ran away in panic, each in a different direction in chaos and fear. They no longer cared about going together. The only thing they could think of now was to escape this terrifying forest. Escape the pursuit of the terrifying red-robed female ghost. Their footsteps echoed in the forest, mixed with the whistling wind and other strange sounds, creating a haunting, terrifying soundtrack. They didn't know if they could survive this forest, but they knew that if they were caught, their fate would be worse than death. In extreme panic, Alex ran forward. The sharp branches scratched his face, leaving bloody scratches. He didn't dare to turn back, only hearing Sarah's shrill screams echoing behind him. His footsteps pounded on the dry leaves. His panting echoed in the silent forest. He knew that if he slowed down, he would become the red-robed female's next prey. After a while of running without stopping, Alex felt exhausted. He stopped, leaned against an old tree, trying to catch his breath. Darkness still surrounded him. Only the faint moonlight filtered through the leaves. He listened, but he could no longer hear the voices of his friends. He was completely alone in this terrifying forest. Suddenly, a strange noise rang out right behind him. A high-pitched screech, like the sound of claws scratching the bark of a tree. Alex turned around in surprise. And in the dim moonlight, he saw the red eyes of a large animal staring at him. It was a puma, its fur jet black, blending into the darkness. It bared its teeth, growling menacingly, ready to pounce on him at any moment. Alex knew he had no chance against this beast. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. A terrifying roar rang out, followed by an eerie silence. Elsewhere in the woods, Megan struggled to move on her sprained ankle. Every step she took was excruciating pain. She dragged herself along, hoping to find a trail that led out of the woods. But the deeper she went, the more lost she felt. The trees all around her looked identical, with no indication that she was going in the right direction. As Megan was trying to cross a bog, she suddenly felt something cold and slippery wrap around her leg. She looked down and was horrified to see that it was a giant python. Its body as thick as a house pillar. Squeezing her leg, Megan struggled, but to no avail. The snake tightened its grip, making it difficult for her to breathe. She looked up to the sky, begging for help, but all she could see were dense trees and vast darkness. A bone-cracking sound rang out, And then there was eternal silence. Chris ran deeper into the forest, trying to escape the pursuit of the red-robed demon. He ran without stopping, despite the branches tearing at his clothes and skin. He heard Sarah screaming behind him, but he did not dare to turn around. He knew that if he stopped, he would share her fate. As Chris ran through an area with many fallen trees, he suddenly tripped over a rotten log and fell. His head hit a rock, knocking him unconscious immediately. When he regained consciousness, he found himself in a deep hole, surrounded by darkness and eerie silence. He tried to stand up, but could not move. He felt a sharp pain throughout his body. He knew that his leg was broken. In the darkness, Chris heard soft footsteps approaching him. He tried to look up, and in the dim moonlight, he saw the tall figure of the red-robed female ghost standing right at the edge of the pit, looking down at him with a terrifying smile. She raised her hand, and a cold wind blew by, carrying the stench of blood. Chris screamed in horror, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness and silence of the forest. Sarah, after being separated from her friends, still tried to run away in desperation. She ran through dense bushes, dark trails, hoping to find a way out of this terrifying forest. But it seemed that the forest did not want to let her go. She kept hearing strange noises, terrifying whispers ringing in her ears. Finally, Sarah was exhausted and collapsed under a tree. She sat there, hugging herself, sobbing. She knew that she would never be able to escape from this place. Suddenly, she saw a bright red streak passing between the trees. The red-robed female ghost appeared before her, her face pale with deep black eyes staring at her. Sarah could not speak. She could only look at her with horror. The ghost slowly raised her hand, and before Sarah could react, she disappeared, leaving behind a terrifying silence and a chill that pierced her bones. Sarah sat there alone in the dark. Her heart stopped beating with fear. She knew that her fate had been decided. For many days after that, no one saw Alex, Megan, Chris, or Sarah return. Large-scale searches were organized, but no trace of them was found. It was assumed that they had gotten lost and died in the dangerous Hockomock forest. But the locals believe in the creepy stories of the red-robed female ghost and the souls imprisoned in this forest. They believe that the forest has taken the lives of those who dared to trespass. And from then on, no one dared to set foot in Hockomock again. The mysterious forest still stands there, silent and scary, forever a warning of the dangers lurking in the dark. Story 2. The majestic beauty of Crawford Notch State Park in New Hampshire. In the summer of 2012, the majestic beauty of Crawford Notch State Park in New Hampshire attracts thousands of visitors every year. But hidden behind that beautiful natural scenery are creepy stories about a ghostly woman in white, known locally as the white-robed lady. She is a spirit said to appear at night, hovering among the ancient trees, terrorizing anyone who dares to venture into this remote area after sunset. Emily, a college student and avid hiker, heard about the legend from a friend. At first, she thought it was just a tale made up to scare children. But part of her was curious and wanted to find out for herself. She invited her 3 best friends, Ben, Olivia, and Ethan, to join her on a hike through Crawford Notch, planning to camp overnight in a less frequented area. Ben, a practical and somewhat skeptical person, tried to dissuade Emily, but her enthusiasm and Olivia and Ethan's agreement made him reluctantly agree. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," Ben said as they began to hike further down the trail. "Those stories about the White Lady don't sound very good." Emily laughed. "Don't worry, Ben. It's just a ghost story. We'll be careful and stay off the trail." Olivia and Ethan were more excited, walking and taking in the beautiful scenery around them. As they went deeper into the canyon, the towering cliffs on both sides of the trail gradually blocked out the sunlight, making the space dark and damp. The initial chirping of birds gave way to an eerie silence, leaving only the sound of their footsteps echoing through the vast space. Megan felt a vague sense of unease, as if someone was watching them from behind the trees. As night began to fall, they found a flat area next to a small stream and decided to set up camp there. They quickly set up a tent and lit a fire to cook and stay warm. As the fire flickered, casting ghostly shadows on the rocks and trees around them, Ethan began to recount the stories he had heard about the White Lady. "They say she's the spirit of a woman who died in a terrible accident in this canyon many years ago," Ethan whispered, his voice a little creepy. "She often appears on full moon nights, hovering high in the trees, searching for the people who caused her death. What if we see her?" Olivia asked timidly. Ethan shrugged. "No one knows for sure, but some say that if you see Lady Bai Yi, you will be haunted by her and lose your soul. When you return home, you will feel empty and disoriented for months." The night fell deeper and deeper. The sound of the wind whistling through the crevices of the rocks sounded like a mournful cry. The campfire gradually died down. Darkness enveloped the canyon, carrying with it invisible fears. Suddenly, from above came a strange sound, like the sound of silk tearing. All four of them were startled, looking up at the tall trees in the dark. They did not know if the legend of Lady Bai Yi would come true tonight. After the terrifying sound of tearing cloth echoed from the tall trees, all four of them fell silent, their eyes tensely looking up at the pitch-black night sky. The wind still whistled softly through the crevices of the rocks, but it could no longer drown out the anxiety that was rising in each person's heart. Ethan shined his flashlight on the bare branches, but all he saw was pitch black. "Did you see anything?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Ben shook his head, his expression doubtful. "It was probably just a big bird. Don't get your head around it." But Emily wasn't sure. She felt a sudden rush of cold air, making her shiver even though she was sitting close to the fire. She looked around the campsite, feeling as if someone was watching them from the shadows. "I don't think so," Emily said, her voice small but full of concern. "That doesn't sound like a bird." Suddenly, a pale light appeared between the trees. Above them, it wasn't the light of the campfire, but a cold white, like moonlight but much brighter. It hung in midair, unblinking, creating an eerie and terrifying scene. All four of them held their breaths, eyes wide open, staring at the strange white light. It slowly moved, gliding gently between the trees, without making any sound. As the light got closer, they began to make out a vague figure within it. It was the figure of a woman, wearing a pure white dress, her long black hair falling down to cover her face. She was floating in the air, not touching the ground, as light as mist. Her white dress fluttered slightly in the wind, even though there was no wind blowing. A choked scream escaped Olivia's throat. Ben's face turned pale, and Ethan stood rooted to the spot, the flashlight in his hand falling to the ground. Emily felt her heart stop, an extreme fear spreading throughout her body. "Bye, Lady Bai Yi," Ethan stuttered, his voice trembling. The female ghost slowly turned her head towards them. Even though her face was hidden by her hair, they could still feel a cold and sorrowful gaze piercing their hearts. The air around them became colder than ever, as if the breath of death was breathing down their necks. The female ghost said nothing. She just hovered there, looking at them in silence. But this silence was more terrifying than any sound. It contained a deep sadness and an eternal loneliness, causing the witnesses to feel cold to the bone. After a moment that seemed to last forever, the female ghost slowly turned and glided gently into the depths of the forest, the pale white light gradually fading behind the trees. When the ghost was completely gone, the four of them dared to breathe heavily. They looked at each other in horror and shock. What they had just witnessed was beyond their imagination. The legend of the white-robed lady was not just a ghost story they had heard. It was a terrifying truth, and they had encountered it. That night, none of them dared to leave the tent. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to every sound in the forest, and praying until the dawn dispelled the horror they had just experienced. They knew that this expedition had changed them forever, and they would never forget the cold night they had seen the White Lady in Crawford Notch. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the trees, all four of them rose almost simultaneously. Without discussion, the horror of the previous night still haunted them, making every move hasty and clumsy. Tents were hastily packed, belongings hastily stuffed into backpacks. The only thing on their minds was to get out of Crawford Notch as quickly as possible, leaving the terrifying white ghost behind. "We have to go now," Emily said, her voice urgent, her eyes constantly glancing toward the dense trees. "I don't want to stay here another minute." Ben nodded, his face pale. "I agree. We'll follow the trail we came by. Just keep going as fast as we can." Olivia and Ethan didn't say anything, just nodded silently, their faces still filled with fear. They started moving, walking quickly on the wet trail. No one dared to look back, afraid that they would see the white-robed ghost hovering among the trees. As they walked a fair distance, the fog began to thicken, covering the trail and the surrounding trees. The white fog limited visibility, making everything blurry and hard to distinguish. "The fog is so thick," Ethan said, his voice a little worried. "I'm not sure if we're on the right path." Ben stopped, looking around cautiously. "I think we're still on the right track. Just stick to the trail." But the deeper they went into the fog, the more winding and difficult it seemed to be. They had to stop frequently to determine their direction, and the feeling of being lost became more and more obvious. Suddenly, from within the dense fog, they heard a soft cracking sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. All four of them stopped, startled, and listened intently. The footsteps were getting closer, and they could sense the presence of someone, or something, coming toward them. "Is anyone there?" Ben called out, his voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, only the footsteps growing clearer, and the wet mist dripping from the branches. Then, from within the white fog, a blurry figure appeared. It was the image of a woman dressed in white, her long black hair falling down to cover her face. She was floating in the air, not touching the ground, and her white dress fluttered gently in the mist. Another scream of horror rang out from Olivia's throat. Ben and Ethan also turned pale, standing still as if rooted to the spot. Emily felt her heart stop, extreme fear welling up in her heart. The white-robed ghost slowly raised its hand, facing them. A cold wind suddenly blew past, carrying a strong jasmine scent, but mixed with a strange fishy smell. "You cannot escape me," a shrill voice rang out. The sound seemed to tear through the quiet space. The four of them ran away in panic, each in a different direction in the thick fog. They could no longer see each other, only hearing their own hurried footsteps and panting. They ran without knowing where to go, just trying to escape the pursuit of the terrifying white-robed ghost. Emily ran as fast as she could, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know where she was going, only feeling a terrifying coldness following her. She stumbled several times, but still tried to stand up and continue running. Suddenly, she saw a faint light ahead. She hurriedly ran towards the light, hoping that it was the exit from the forest. But when she got closer, she was horrified to realize that it was just a large swamp. The water was black and smelled foul. She tried to stop, but it was too late. She slipped and fell into the swamp, sinking into the sticky black mud. She tried to call for help, but no one heard. Darkness enveloped her, and she felt herself being pulled into a bottomless abyss. Elsewhere, Ben was trying to cross an area with many large rocks. He jumped from one rock to another, but the thick fog made it impossible for him to see the path. Suddenly, he slipped and fell into a deep crevice. He screamed in pain, and then there was a terrifying silence. Olivia and Ethan ran together, trying to stay on the trail, but the fog was so thick that they lost each other. Olivia continued to run alone, feeling completely alone and hopeless. She kept calling Ethan's name, but there was no response. Suddenly, she saw a white-clothed ghost standing right in front of her, hovering in the air, blocking her path. Olivia couldn't move. She could only stand there, staring at the ghost with terrified eyes. Ethan, after losing Olivia, continued to run hopelessly. He felt like he was lost in a maze with no way out. The trees around him seemed to be moving, the shadows flickering, making it impossible for him to distinguish what was real and what was imaginary. Suddenly, he heard the familiar sound of tearing cloth behind him. He turned his head and saw the white-robed ghost hovering above him, her long white dress torn to shreds, her face looking down at him with a terrifying smile. Ethan knew that this was his end. He closed his eyes, waiting for the terrible thing that was about to happen. Ben woke up in a dark crevice of the rocks, the pain in his leg making him groan. He tried to move, but it was useless. His leg was broken in an odd position. He knew that he could not escape on his own. Despair began to invade his mind. He called out Emily's, Olivia's and Ethan's names, but only the echoes came back from the cold cliffs. He was completely alone, trapped in the darkness and pain. Suddenly, he heard a soft noise above the mouth of the crevice. He looked up and saw the shadowy figure of Lady Bai Yi hovering over him. Her face was still hidden by her long black hair, but Ben could feel an endless sadness radiating from her figure. She said nothing, just stood there looking at him in silence. But this silence made Ben feel colder than any scream. He knew that she had come to take him away. A paralyzing fear invaded his entire body. He tried to plead, but he couldn't speak. The female ghost slowly descended, and Ben felt a cold hand touch his forehead. Everything fell into eternal darkness. Olivia, after seeing the white-robed ghost blocking her way, stood still in terror. She slowly approached her, her long white dress fluttering in the wind. Olivia tried to retreat, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. As the ghost drew closer, Olivia could see her face more clearly. It was pale and haggard, with deep black eyes filled with an indescribable sadness. Her lips moved, and Olivia heard a faint whisper, like a cold breath, "Stay with me." A cold hand touched Olivia's cheek, and a feeling of emptiness and lifelessness spread throughout her body. She no longer felt fear, only a terrifying emptiness and coldness. Ethan, after seeing the white-robed lady hovering above him, closed his eyes, waiting for something terrible to happen. But instead of feeling pain, he felt a strange sense of peace. He slowly opened his eyes and saw the female ghost standing right in front of him. Her face was no longer as scary as he had imagined, but instead was filled with deep sadness and utter loneliness. She reached out her hand, and Ethan felt an inexplicable urge to take that hand. When her cold hand touched his, a cold current ran down Ethan's spine. He felt as if his soul was being sucked out of his body. He looked into her sad eyes, and in that moment, he understood all the pain and loss she had endured. He no longer felt fear, only deep sympathy. He followed her, blending into the darkness of the forest. The next morning, when the sun rose, no one had seen Emily. Ben, Olivia, and Ethan returned. A massive search was organized, but all that was found was an abandoned tent and traces of a panicked run. No bodies were ever found. A few weeks later, Emily was found in a daze, lost in thought, on a road dozens of miles from Crawford Notch. When she was brought home, she was unrecognizable. Her eyes were blank and lifeless. She could not remember anything that had happened in the woods. Doctors diagnosed her with severe psychological trauma, but no one could explain her strange condition. The locals were not surprised. They knew that those who saw the White Lady in Crawford Notch would never be the same again. They believed that she had taken the souls of those young people, leaving them forever in a heartless and empty world. Since then, Crawford Notch has become a cursed place in the minds of many people. The stories of the White Lady and the ill-fated explorers have been woven with more creepy details. It is said that, on full moon nights, if you dare to set foot in Crawford Notch, you can see the white-robed ghost hovering among the trees. And if you are unlucky enough to meet her eyes, you will forever lose your soul, becoming a soulless corpse, mentally unstable in this world. And that is why, to this day, no one dares to venture near Crawford Notch after nightfall. The third story. The Pine Barrens in New Jersey. The Pine Barrens in New Jersey in late fall 2005 had a wild and eerie beauty. The tall pine trees, their trunks covered with moss, stood close together like silent ghosts. Underfoot was a layer of fine white sand, stretching far and wide, creating winding trails leading deep into the mysterious forest. This place was famous for strange stories, unexplained disappearances, and rumors of a terrifying evil entity lurking in the darkness. Kevin, a young man who was always fascinated by the mysterious and creepy, had heard many stories about this forest. He was especially impressed by the story of a man dressed in black, who was said to appear frequently at night, jumping nimbly on the tallest trees. It was said that if anyone accidentally encountered him, they would be haunted by him and lose their peace of mind. Along with his three best friends Ashley, Mike and Brittany, Kevin decided to go on an expedition deep into the Pine Barrens on a moonless night, hoping to witness this strange phenomenon with his own eyes. Ashley, though a little nervous, was intrigued. Mike, an adventurous person, was very excited. Only Brittany felt uneasy and tried to dissuade everyone, but was eventually convinced to join. "I'm still not sure," Brittany said as they began to walk into the forest, her eyes never leaving the dark shadows of the trees. "I heard this forest is dangerous, easy to get lost in, and there are also strange things happening." Kevin smiled confidently, patting Brittany's shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll be careful. We'll only go a short distance, mainly to experience the feeling." Mike nodded in agreement, his face full of excitement. Ashley was silent, but her eyes couldn't hide her curiosity and a little fear. As they walked deeper into the forest, darkness began to fall. The weak flashlight was just enough to illuminate the narrow path ahead. The wind blew gently through the pine branches, making strange rustling sounds, like someone was whispering. A feeling of loneliness and creepiness enveloped the group. When night fell completely, they decided to stop by a small stream and make a campfire. The fire flickered, casting ghostly shadows on the surrounding trees. Mike began to tell the creepy stories he had collected about the Pine Barrens. About people who had gone missing and supernatural phenomena that had been witnessed. They say that on the darkest nights, when there's no moon, the shadow of a man in black appears. Mike whispered, his voice slightly creepy. He jumps from tree to tree, lightning fast. If anyone sees him, he haunts them, and when they return home, their minds are blank and terrified for months. Do you believe that? Brittany asked timidly. Mike shrugged. I don't know, but there's a lot of strange things that happen in these woods. We better be careful. As the night wore on, the wind grew stronger, whistling through the pines like a long, mournful howl. The campfire gradually died down. Darkness enveloped the forest, bringing with it invisible fears. Suddenly, from above came a strange noise. It sounded like someone was jumping from one tree branch to another. Very quickly and lightly, all four of them were startled and looked up at the tall trees in the dark, trying to find the source of that scary sound. They didn't know if they would have to face the black-clothed ghost that people had been rumored to see tonight. After the strange noise in the treetops, all four of them held their breath, tensely watching the darkness above. The wind was still whistling softly, but now it was mixed with other sounds, more definite sounds, as if someone was moving very quickly and lightly on the tall tree branches. The noise was sometimes near, sometimes far, making everyone's anxiety increase even more. Did you guys hear that? Ashley asked softly, her voice trembling, clinging tightly to Kevin's arm. Mike nodded, his eyes never leaving the dark foliage. It looks like it's moving around us. Brittany hugged herself, her face pale with fear. I don't like this. We should put out the fire and get in. Kevin shined his flashlight into the trees, searching for any sign of it. The weak light only illuminated a small area, but it was enough for them to notice the branches shaking unnaturally, as if someone had jumped over them. The noise rang out again, this time clearer and much closer. It was no longer a gentle jumping sound, but the sound of something large and heavy falling from above. All four of them startled and looked up. At that moment, among the dense foliage, they saw a large black shadow falling at a terrifying speed. The shadow had the shape of a tall man, dressed in a jet black outfit, almost blending into the darkness of the night. He fell gently, making no sound when he hit the ground, then stood up straight, staring at Kevin's group. A scream of horror rang out from Brittany's throat. Ashley also screamed, hugging Kevin tightly. Mike stood rooted to the spot, the flashlight in his hand falling to the ground. Kevin felt his heart stop, an extreme fear spreading throughout his body. The shadow of the man in black stood there, motionless like a statue. His face was hidden in the darkness, but they could feel a cold and piercing gaze piercing their hearts. Silence fell over the forest, leaving only the heavy breathing of the four friends. Then, a sinister smile appeared on his face hidden in the darkness. That smile was not a human smile, but a sinister and terrifying sneer. In that moment, they felt a cold chill run down their spines. The figure of the man in black suddenly moved. He jumped onto a nearby tree trunk with extraordinary speed and agility. as if he did not obey any laws of physics. He climbed up the tree with great speed, then squatted on a high branch, looking down at them with eyes shining in the darkness. A long and terrifying howl rang out from his throat, the sound tearing apart the quiet night. The howl was unlike any animal they had ever heard. It had a terrifying and menacing tone, making their blood freeze. "We have to run," Kevin shouted, pulling Ashley up by the hand. Mike and Brittany also came to their senses, quickly standing up and running after Kevin. They ran as fast as they could into the darkness, not daring to look back. The terrifying howl of the man in black still echoed behind them, like a curse chasing them in the dark night of the Barrens. They knew that they had awakened an evil force, and they would pay the price for their curiosity. The four friends ran as fast as they could in the dense darkness of the Barrens, their heavy breathing echoing among the silent trees. They did not dare to look back, only knowing to run forward, hoping to escape the pursuit of the terrifying man in black. Branches brushed their faces, tangled their legs, but no one dared to stop. The horror they had just experienced still haunted them, urging them to run even faster. Where are we going?" Ashley asked as she ran, her voice broken with panting. Kevin shook his head. He didn't know the direction either. "I don't know. Just run. Run as far as you can." The eerie howl of the black-clothed figure still echoed behind them, sometimes near, sometimes far, as if taunting their despair. They heard him jumping from tree to tree, the sound of branches cracking in the quiet night. It felt like he was chasing them, gliding over the towering treetops at an unbelievable speed. As they passed through a dense area, Mike suddenly tripped over a tree root and fell. He cried out in pain. Kevin and Ashley quickly stopped, pulling him up. "Are you okay?" Kevin asked worriedly. Mike grimaced, rubbing his knee. "I'm fine, just a little sore." But before they could go any further, another sound was heard, this time very close. Heavy footsteps were coming towards them from the darkness. Not human footsteps, but the sound of claws scraping the ground. "There's something else," Brittany shouted, pointing into the darkness between the pine trees. In the dim light of their flashlights, they saw the glowing red eyes of a large animal staring at them. It looked like a wolf, but much larger, with jet black fur and sharp teeth. It growled menacingly, ready to pounce at them at any moment. "Run!" Kevin shouted again, pushing everyone forward. They continued running, having to deal with the black-clothed figure in the trees while avoiding the ferocious animal on the ground. As they reached a small stream, Mike suddenly slipped and fell into the water. He let out a loud scream. Kevin and Ashley rushed back to help him, but as they neared the stream, they were horrified to find that Mike had been pulled underwater by something. They could only see the bubbles on the black water, and then the eerie silence. "Mike!" Kevin and Ashley shouted together, but there was no answer. The water was still as a sheet. No sign of Mike. Brittany sobbed. "What are we going to do? We can't leave him here." But Kevin knew they didn't have time to think. The figure in black was still chasing them, and now they had to face another danger in the water. "We have to go," Kevin said, his voice choked with pain and fear. "We can't help him anymore." Ashley looked at Kevin with hatred, but she knew he was right. They had no choice. They and Brittany continued running, leaving their best friend behind in the darkness and cold of the Pine Barrens. As they ran deeper into the forest, the paths became more winding and difficult to follow. They lost their way, not knowing where they were going. All they could see were the towering pine trees and the darkness. The terrifying howl of the black figure still echoed, a reminder that they were not yet free of pursuit. Suddenly, a deep chasm appeared before them. They stopped, staring down into the pitch-black darkness below. They had nowhere else to go. They were cornered. From behind them, they heard the familiar noise again. The sound of him jumping from tree to tree. Getting closer and closer. They knew that the black figure had found them. The three of them stood there, frozen in fear, waiting for the terrible thing to happen. They felt like they were falling into a nightmare with no way out. Surrounded by the evil forces of the Barrens, their fate seemed to have been decided. Kevin, Ashley, and Brittany stood motionless on the edge of the abyss, the darkness threatening to swallow everything. The wind howled through the pine trees, carrying the cold and the smell of damp earth. They knew there was no way to escape. Behind them was the shadow of the man in black, slowly approaching, the sound of him jumping from branch to branch becoming clearer and clearer. "What are we going to do now?" Brittany sobbed, hugging Ashley's arm tightly, her whole body shaking. Ashley tried to act strong, but her face was pale with fear. I don't know. Maybe we should try to fight back." Kevin looked down into the abyss. The darkness seemed bottomless. He felt a surge of despair rise within him. They had gone too deep into the forest, and there was no way back now. The shadow of the man in black was very close. He stood right behind them, tall and dark, like a shadow. He said nothing, just stood there looking at them with eyes that glowed in the night. Suddenly, he reached out, grabbed Ashley by the collar and lifted her up. Ashley screamed in terror, trying to struggle, but it was no use. His strength was too great. In the blink of an eye, he threw Ashley into the abyss. Her scream echoed in the space and then stopped. Brittany watched the horrific scene unfold, screaming in pain and despair. She turned to run, but the man in black was faster than her. He grabbed her from behind, squeezing her neck tightly. Brittany tried to gasp, her hands clawing at his arms, but couldn't escape. Her face turned red and then gradually turned purple. A soft cracking sound rang out, and Brittany collapsed, motionless. Kevin stood there, witnessing the horrific deaths of his two friends, his whole body trembling. He knew that he was next. The man in black slowly turned to look at him, a devilish smile appearing on his face again. "You think you can escape me?" he said, his voice hoarse and cold, like the wind whistling through dry branches. Kevin didn't answer. He just looked at him with eyes full of hatred and fear. He knew that he had no chance against him. The shadow of the man in black approached Kevin, his hand reaching out, his long, bony fingers touching his face. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. He closed his eyes, waiting for the horror to come. A long, terrifying howl rang out, followed by an eerie silence. A few days later, Kevin's body was found at the bottom of the abyss. His face was distorted with fear, his eyes wide open, staring up at the sky. No trace of Ashley and Brittany was ever found. It was assumed that they had fallen into the abyss and were eaten by wild animals. The story of Kevin, Ashley, Mike and Brittany's terrifying expedition quickly spread throughout the region. Locals recounted the chilling details they had heard of the shadow of the man in black jumping from trees and the terrifying howls that echoed from the forest at night. Those who have been lost in the Pine Barrens and were lucky enough to survive said that after seeing the shadow of the man in black, they felt as if their souls had been stolen. They became apathetic, lost all emotion and lived like soulless corpses for months. Since then, the Pine Barrens has become a cursed place, a forest that no one dares to venture into after sunset. It is believed that the shadow of the man in black still lurks in the darkness of the forest, waiting for the next victim, spreading terror and stealing the souls of those who dare to challenge his fear. And that is why, until today, the Pine Barrens remains a mysterious and terrifying forest, where eerie howls still echo in the quiet night, reminding people of the lost souls and the terrifying black ghost that forever reigns here. If you find this story meaningful, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel to follow other stories of